Today we've got Dr. Chris Warren, who's rapidly gaining an international recognition for his work in developing ways of encouraging guests to play their part in reducing resource use. But before we talk about that, Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, hi everybody. Hello, Harold. I'm currently speaking to you from Kangaroo Valley in New South Wales, Australia, where I'm co-proprietor of a small accommodation business called Crystal Creek Meadows. I'm also a research fellow at Griffith University in Queensland, and I'm the founder of My Green Butler, which is a sustainable management service that's cloud-based for tourism.
Chris, given that we're doing this for the Arabian travel market, do you want to just reflect a bit on your experience of working in that region, where you've worked and what you learned from it?
Well, I spent a third of my life working in the Middle East. I've lived in Egypt, in Jeddah and Saudi Arabia and Dubai, but I've traveled all over. I was set up one of the first women's only office in Saudi Arabia providing marketing support. I worked for a variety of international businesses and local companies, and also involved in the launch of a number of hotel properties in Dubai, like the Hilton and so forth. I saw really Dubai really grow up once the Chicago beach was knocked down and Jumeirah Hotel was put up. I was there during that period and of that change. So I've seen a lot of changes, and now as Saudi Arabia is welcoming international tourists beyond Umrah and so forth, I've seen a lot of changes there. I think what's particularly stayed with me and helped me in my own hospitality career has been the whole concept of Arab hospitality, for which I personally enjoyed through my time living there, and how important that is, and understanding the importance of going the extra mile to deliver real quality service to guests. And that's been an invaluable learning for me. And understanding also other cultures and how important that is when one puts it into the context of responsibility and sustainability. And since I left the Middle East, I've been living now in Australia, but I've done several consultancy projects in the UAE, in Jordan, Saudi Arabia. So I'm still very much active in the region, and my service now, the My Green Butler service, is available for people in the Middle East.
Chris, if I remember rightly, some of the work that's informed My Green Butler actually originated with work in the UAE.
Yes, I developed a course for the Dubai government on sustainable tourism, and through that process I introduced the ideas of Arab hospitality and how that can be a method to engage guests and encourage them to participate a bit further in terms of conserving resources. And that's part of the content of the course that's now used for all hoteliers in the region.
Chris, can we just go back a bit before we talk about My Green Butler in more detail? I followed the development of My Green Butler with great interest. How did the idea develop? Where did it originate?
Well, it originated because I am a hotelier myself, and I realized I was getting to a green ceiling in terms of undertaking all the normal activities one might do to reduce consumption and reduce carbon emissions. But I got to a point where I couldn't really progress any further without a great deal of expenditure. So it's a green ceiling that I think a lot of businesses get to. I then enrolled in the Responsible Tourism Management course at Leeds Beckett, which you ran. And through that understanding and doing my thesis with you, I then realized there was another potential dimension. We'd always been looking in hospitality about introducing methods to reduce waste, reduce consumption and carbon emissions, but without really interfering with the guest's experience. And then with my thesis, which I did with you, we undertook a number of surveys where we actually asked people whether they were really interested in pro-environmental action for holidays, and a whole series of questions that really sort of repeated a lot of other surveys, but we were looking at it from the perspective of Australia. What I found when I was undertaking those surveys was that after asking some of the questions, people wanted to carry on talking. They wanted to explain why they were giving me the answer. Now, I'd found from the previous surveys they had never been open-ended answers to those questions. So if I asked people, why would they find it difficult to change their habits when staying in accommodation, etc., they would then gush forward with answers, and that really enriched the thesis. And it really, the penny dropped, because prior to that, I had been a little bit John Cleese-like in Fawlty Towers, walking around my own property, a bit shocked about how people were using resources, and I thought wasting them. And I thought, well, it's because obviously they're not caring. And that would be a natural assumption to make. But when I looked at those research findings, I realized actually people really generally want to do something, but they don't necessarily know how. And therefore I realized, well, what we need to do is introduce information in a manner that doesn't disrupt the stay experience, that still provides politeness and a positive stay experience, but invites people to participate if they wish to, and to provide them the tools and methods to allow them to do that. So it really came from that research on the masters, and then progressed over years as I developed the system and did trials.
Can you say something about the PhD you did with Suzanne Beckett?
Yes, so Susanna Beckett and I did my PhD with her and Alexandra Coghlan at Griffiths University, where I had already developed a prototype for my Green Butler, and so I then applied it for 16 months at my own business. I think this is important because from two aspects. Firstly, that everything that I'm talking about today are things that I've personally done and personally applied to my own paying guests. And that's, been my livelihood. So I don't want anyone to think that these are ideas that are dreamt up separate to the reality of delivering hospitality. And obviously through those 16 months, we went through very much a peer-assessed process of undertaking the research, and the findings were being published in 5 different journals. So we went through blind peer assessment in that. So when people look at that research, they will be reassured that it was done in a thorough professional way, in a scholastic way. And the findings delivered something very precious. They showed that guests were overall prepared to make a difference in the way they were operating. We saved 38% in biomass use, 33% saving in electricity, 21% in water, and 20% in gas. And this was consistent across the 16 months that we were doing it. So it wasn't like on an odd occasion, we had half our sample were in control. They did not have any My Green Butler interaction, and we treated them in the normal fashion we would have done previously. However, the other guests went through an additional stage of a meet and greet, an additional stage of information we provided them, which was feedback on what they were using, so they could see how much resources they were using, and they could compare that with the target ambition that we had and against best performers. So a game-like experience in effect. Now, remembering, Harold, that we charge around 400 Australian dollars a night.
How much is that in US dollars, Chris? Just so that
in US dollars, that would be, depending on today's exchange rate, that would be approximately 250 to 300 US dollars.
So you're hardly a cheap property, are you?
No, and in Australian terms, that is, in the premium range.
Yeah.
So people are coming down here paying that sort of rate, and when they arrive, I'm inviting them to conserve their resource use. So that's obviously seems contradictory to the concept of luxury cottages. But it was very successful, and now we're applying it in pilot sites in three regions of the world right now.
Can I just ask you to explain, because you distinguish in what you write about the difference between guest participation and guest engagement. What's the difference in your view?
In my view, I think as a generalization, when we talk about guest engagement, it sounds positive. It sounds like we are involving them. But frankly, what happens is that we have used things like tent cards or letters or maybe some information on a website. But there's whereby we're inviting the guest to do something. But it's very much a side factor. We can say we're engaging with them because we've left them some information, But engagement, it gives them the option of not doing anything. We're not seeking to marry them. We're actually asking them really to participate, which is much further than just inviting someone to do something. We're actually asking them to change how we're planning to function within that hospitality environment. And it's rather the same as the way that you approach tourism from a responsible tourism point of view as opposed to sustainable tourism. Responsible tourism meaning taking action, taking responsibility for the impacts, whereas guest participation is similar in the sense that we're asking them to participate to reduce that footprint and to actively try to seek to reduce it, which frankly, although it's a bit embarrassing for tourism, is rather unique. But as I've said, it's been successful. How do I quantify successful? 80% of the guests that have the experience say it strongly adds to their stay experience. So we have to acknowledge that. We have to also acknowledge that guest reviews increase. We have to acknowledge that it allowed me to increase my price of my accommodation. And I've had an increase in the number of guests, despite the fact that I've asked them to try and reduce by participating.
Chris,
so there's a big difference.
Chris, forgive me for saying this, but this sounds too good to be true. And the old adage that if it sounds too good to be true, it is too good to be true. Are you really telling me that you don't get any major resistance from your clients?
I get resistance. What type of resistance, though? That's the important thing. I would say that 20%.
Let me phrase the question more precisely. Have you had the level of resistance which has caused you to lose a client?
No.
And that's the acid test, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the resistance is I don't wish to be involved in this idea. I don't want to participate. And that would be, my estimate would be around about 20% of guests.
Right.
20% of guests are very enthusiastic, and 60% of guests are surprised. They've never come across this. But surprise doesn't mean a negative response. And I think that's one of the weaknesses in hospitality globally as a standard. And I understand the issues in the Middle East, but we expect everyone to only want to smile all the time, and therefore that means they're happy. But we use smiling to really, should we say, manage situations. If people don't smile when you suggest that they can participate, it does not mean they are unhappy. It means they're considering what you're saying. Now, of the 20% that don't participate, they simply don't participate. They still have a great stay. We're not enforcing it. We're inviting them to participate, to assist us. And you'll find that some people say, look, it's very important to me that I have this time and I want to use a lot of water and so forth. To go, fine, that's okay. I've got 80% of my guests saving. That's a good outcome.
It is indeed. Can I go on to ask you, why do you think people don't resist? Because the way you've just phrased that, you've said you want them to help you, but isn't it more broadly that they're helping the environment and are feeling good about the fact that they're doing something good for the environment?
That's definitely a reason. I think people have multiple emotions and motivations to do it. I don't think one should just simply place it in a box of saying it's for environmental good or whatever. I think it's sometimes people like a challenge. When I'm offering it in Australia, they're sports mad and they like the competition element. In the UK, it's much more about fiscal savings. And when I see it in Europe, it's more about the comfort and the pleasure they'll get from that process, because obviously we give them advice on how to save and what actually are the benefits of saving. So overall, there's a multiple range of different emotions, and one shouldn't really typecast them. Expect that there will be.
So there's a broad business case for this, even in a period of recession and possibly depression that we're going into now?
I think is even a stronger reason. In fact, this is an opportune time for it. Why? It's because a recession, depression, people haven't forgotten that we need to be mindful of finite resources. People are feeling guilty about wasting resources, and people are unsure about how much they're wasting in hotels because they don't necessarily know. They don't even know how to save. So that hasn't gone away. So from my examples to you of 80%, 80% of people are still anxious about the environment. And from all the surveys that you would have seen, as everybody has seen, the environment is still very much high in people's minds. Obviously, the financial situation is also high. Yeah, and so that needs to be recognized. But the environment hasn't disappeared. Concern for the environment hasn't disappeared. It's still an important factor. But running a business, now in these very difficult circumstances, requires a much more astute way of running the operation. And I would urge people right now to use the lockdown period and the data that they find within it as a valuable lesson in actually how much their buildings are wasting. So for my clients, I'm able to identify during this period the amount of water they're leaking out, the amount of machinery that's still being left on, how much energy is being used, and then ask the question, well, who is responsible for turning the lights out when tourism closed? So it reveals operational factors. In summary, what we are doing is obviously we're reducing costs because we're making the systems more effective, either more effective to provide for a greater number of people, or more effective by reducing the amount you're using for the same amount of people. Overall, you're improving cash flow, which is critical for any business survival at this time. And remembering in the areas I'm dealing with, which is laundry, waste, fuel, water, and energy, what you're dealing with there is at least 40% of costs. And then if you're also tracking the very fact of some roles and responsibilities need to be improved, and you're looking at the overhead of staff between 20 to 30%, we're dealing with the fundamentals of business survival. And critically, if you integrate the value of improving the guest stay and helping the environment by doing so, which I can talk about later, then what you're doing is you're sharing values with the guest. Normally shared values has been talked about in the past about supply chain and companies working together, but we need to recognize that in the production and consumption of hospitality, on the assembly line of it, if you like, the guests are part of that process. They're using the systems within the building.
Chris, how does your return visitor rate, your rebooking, how does that compare with others in the same part of Australia? Do you know?
I don't have those figures, but I can tell you that now we've come out of lockdown, we're absolutely flat out. And of that proportion, a high number of return guests wanting to come back to us. So it's a good proportion. Is it higher than other people? I can't tell you. We offer a special experience. By that I mean, for the prices we charge, we're really targeting people who are on honeymoon, birthdays, anniversaries, 3-generation get-together, precious family time for family holidays in rural areas. We're not a motel or a business establishment where people can choose. So it's even more an indication of how important it is and how you can motivate people, even on special stays,
Has this been tried and tested in more traditional forms of accommodation, Chris, or is it only working at the top end?
It's working in 2-star property in France. We're using the service in one of the largest hotels in Europe, over 1,000 rooms. We're doing it in timeshare lodges. We're doing it in bed and breakfast and hostels. We're going to be introducing it very shortly now in the next couple of months in international chain hotel and various other types of businesses. So it works in all styles. It's flexible.
Presumably you offer the training for the hospitality staff who are going to be interacting with the customers, because that seems to be the critical part of this. It does require some upskilling of reception, concierge and other staff.
It does, but it's not essential. In other words, you improve the amount that you save with the more interaction from staff. But if you don't have any interaction from staff, you can still communicate what the hotel is doing in terms of monitoring its resources. So we have an in-room TV service, we have digital display services that not fully compensate for no human contact, but are an additional mechanism. So we have a mobile version, so you can see it on your phone. You can see real-time resource use by the hour with advice and tips, etc. But you can also see the overall building's consumption. For the staff, yes, we provide training for the staff, and it actually enriches the staff experience even further, and it helps motivate staff and maintain loyalty. So at this difficult time, one of the things that hospitality managers might consider is staff reduction. It's not a normal process, but thriving businesses actually rarely cut back many staff because they want to keep the knowledge on board, and they also want to keep, not to go through the cost of process of rehiring people in the future. Studies have proven that actually productivity doesn't improve significantly just by reducing staff and asking the rest to work much harder. What you can do is motivate your staff to do better, and My Green Butler's service does that because it gives everybody focuses on the job, focuses on areas of saving, and they can see the benefits in terms of the fiscal savings from the property and how those can be better spent.
Chris, thanks very much for this. It's been a fascinating interview, and I wish you well with the further development of the whole Green Butler approach. It strikes me that one of the things that's unique about you, and there are many, but one of the significant ones is you've actually done your academic research as an accommodation provider, as an owner of a hotel, and that's unfortunately a rare combination. But thanks very much for giving us your time this morning.